Welcome everybody to another video. This one is about RLCS players overrated or underrated. So there was an interesting post on the subreddit recently by John, aka Always. He put out a poll basically of you fill out the form and you say for every single player in the RLCS, are they fairly rated, are they overrated, or are they underrated? Now, of course, this is all subjective and it kind of... when you think too hard about it, it makes absolutely no sense, because if you think that the subreddit thinks that someone's overrated, then are they actually overrated because you think they're overrated, but then that would mean that they're fairly rated or maybe underrated. It makes no sense when you think about it hard, but that's okay. We're going to get through this. Some interesting points to bring up are, I think some of this list could be pertained to casters, like the storylines that we push, maybe the Reddit community doesn't agree with. Sometimes it's just other Redditors that are like really big fans of these people. But I think it's like one of those two usually. Or maybe they're not talked about enough by either us or by the Reddit community. So I think it'd be kind of interesting to see where people think players are at. And I'll tell you if it's the fault of me or not, basically. And let's get into it. Now, there's a lot of rules associated with this. For the full Reddit post, like I'm not going to go over every single player. The full Reddit post I will link in the description below if you want to go check it out. Some nice fancy pie charts to take a look at. But these rules are intense. So I'm actually going to take away the camera for a second here so we can look at these rules. So basically how it works is you are overrated if that was your top voted option. There's only 3 options: overrated, fairly rated, or underrated. So if your top option was overrated, well, you are overrated. I believe the votes came into about 300-ish for each thing. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. Actually, looks like 337 for NA, and then EU might be a little different. Yeah, EU is 299, I think it says. So it goes overrated. If it's your top voted, you're overrated. If you're underrated, it was because your top voted option was underrated. Somewhat overrated means that your second top voted option was overrated, which means you were fairly rated, then you go down to overrated, but you must be at least 1/3 of your votes or higher be in that category. Same with somewhat underrated, same exact rule set. And then fairly rated basically just means, hey, you were fairly rated. Most of the votes came in fairly rated. The other 2 options were below that 1/3 mark, and then you're good to go. So now that we know all that, let's get into it. So obviously, like, some of these rules make some of these numbers sound a little bit more extreme than others. When, like, someone might be overrated, but they might be by 1% overrated. It doesn't, we're just doing this for a fun discussion point, if I say so myself. All right. I'm back. Hello. Here we go. Let's go with underrated players at the start. I'm actually going to bring up the list here because I believe underrated was... okay, it's not the least, but we'll get into that in a bit. So number 5 for underrated was Rizzo at 39.2%. Now this one, I think, is kind of interesting to me because I would feel like the fan bases generally would be too high on Rizzo or too high on like the ones that have really big fan bases. So they would actually go the opposite way to overrated. Now Rizzo's votes were pretty close. But this one surprised me a little bit because obviously G2 had a bad season. But I think every time G2 does bad, the Reddit community sometimes does go directly onto Rizzo because sometimes his mechanical play isn't as high in JNAPs in Chicago. Even if they make the mistakes in that series, sometimes some of the subreddit and stuff will fall back onto Rizzo as the blame most of the time. Like, there's been posts, like threads about, I think Rizzo is to blame. So I think maybe that's why it's underrated. So I think as casters, I don't think we necessarily underrate Rizzo. Like, I think if you went back a year and a half, I rated Rizzo a lot lower than I do now. But I think, at least for me, I think I fairly rate him at this time, where sometimes I'm critical, sometimes I praise him. I think he's somewhere in the middle. But yeah, I'm probably going to think I fairly rate most people. So anyway, let's continue. Number 4, Torment. Now, a lot of these picks, and we'll see it a lot in the underrated and the somewhat underrated, are basically just like, if you're a support player or a third man, you're basically underrated because they don't get the glory of, the goals. Now, the interesting thing is, like, Cloud9, for the most part, was overrated. But Torment himself is an underrated player. I don't know. I don't necessarily agree with this because I do feel like he's gotten his props here or there. And I think last season, like, if anything, I think he might be overrated slightly, just because I think last season a lot of people put blame on Gimmick and just solely on Gimmick, when I think it was the entire team doing poorly. And I don't think Gimmick was necessarily the entirety of the fault there. Torment didn't really help that case. So in my mind, he might be somewhat overrated just because of last season. In general, I think he would be fairly rated. He got the MVP in Season 6. We generally know his role on this team, and it works pretty well. Next up, Farah at 49.5%, underrated. This one probably comes from the subreddit. I feel like the casters and stuff have been praising him a lot more with his leadership and with just his play over the last 2 seasons. At least I was praising him in my my Gibby Awards. I gave him I think it was the surprising player, or one of the surprising players of the year, because of how well he's performed. When I thought at the start of last season, I was like 2020, like Farrah's probably coaching at this point, but it's not the case. Farrah, I wouldn't agree that he's underrated, maybe somewhat underrated if you're talking the entire community. We'll get to Shawset later, because I think this is where I don't agree with this list at all. But we'll continue that. Farrah at 49.5%. That's pretty high. Memory at 51%. I think this has a lot to do with the ghost kick in memory. I would agree to an extent. Like, I think if Ghost lost Illusion first, I think that would have been the better play over Memory, so I could see why you would underrate him. No one else picked him up, obviously. He goes to the last place team, Flight, so makes sense having Memory at 51%. Violent Panda, 59.5%. Now, this one I think is because all the glory goes to Turbo and K-Dop. I think it was, Season 5? I think it was Season 5. He should have won MVP. I was kind of annoyed that he didn't win MVP. I was really pushing hard for him. I think it was Season 5. I can't remember which one because they were so good all the time. But Violent Panda is a great player. I think, say Dignitas didn't have as great of a Worlds as they did. Like, say they just pulled an United and, they were a 4th seed. They just went out on day 2. I don't think Violent Panda would be nearly as high, but because they did so well then, I think people are now coming back onto Violent Panda's side, and people are then going to say, oh, he's underrated. I always believed in him when, they obviously didn't. So I think that's why he gets some of the vote, but I do think he is an underrated player in general. A very good mind of Rocket League, very good vision on the field, and it seems like they're incorporating the old Dignitas style into this new Dignitas, and you would assume Violent Panda has a lot to do with it. So 59.5%. I could see at times when we say he's one of the best captains in the game where you might overrate him, but underrated is where I'd probably put him too. Probably not obviously as high as 59.5%, but pretty high. So those are your underrated players. That means their number one option was underrated. My nose is really itchy. All right. Moving on. Somewhat underrated players. This means they were mostly fairly rated, but at least over 1/3 of their votes were underrated. Now, there's a lot here. We actually have 11 players. Sorry, Sathu, you missed the cut at 34.7%, but he was on this list as well. I think that's all about the whole Space Station kick in Sathu at the time, and then he makes it back into the RLCS. I don't necessarily agree. But I think this is where you will see a lot of those rival series guys. Speed at 35.3%. I don't really understand Speed being somewhat underrated. I think we praise his offensive performances. Mouse choked really hard, and I guess because of this list, they're not putting the blame on Speed as much as maybe his teammates. But I think Speed is pretty fairly rated personally. But again, it's only 35.3%. It's not anything crazy. Shock at 35.3%. He's a player that's coming into the RLCS for the very first time. I think it's, sure, if you want to underrate him, that's fine. I think it's just these new Rival Series guys coming in. I think we've seen over the past season or two that a lot of the Rival Series guys that do come in make big splashes nowadays. So I think that's where the community is banking on. Next up, Casio, 35.6% on Veloce. We'll see a couple of Veloce players. Now, one thing to note, this is also for teams. We haven't seen any teams pop up yet. But it's kind of interesting because we won't see Veloce's name on the underrated list, yet we see 2 of their players, and we'll get to the second one in a second here. But kind of interesting to think about that they also think Flame and Casio both are underrated. And it's like, but you don't think the team is underrated? That, to me, really doesn't line up all that much. Flame, to me, I would have said he's overrated maybe a season ago. I think last season we didn't really talk about Flame and Casio all that much, so I can kind of understand it. It was like the freaky show. We kind of downplayed Veloce, and I can see where some people think they might be underrated, but pretty much consensus from what I've seen is everyone has Veloce relatively low. So I'm a little surprised that both these guys make that list. Extra, another player on here making his RLCS debut. We'll see what happens there. 37%. Missed at 38.3%. Now, this one I could see because Pittsburgh Knights let him go for AJ, and I think a lot of people think that was the wrong move. So I was actually surprised Mist isn't in the completely underrated category, but Mist is definitely a good pick. AXB, Wavefunk's MVP. If you haven't heard Wavefunk talk, he always says AXB is the MVP all the time. AXP on Space Station really doesn't get any credit, and I completely agree here. I'd probably put him even higher into the underrated category because we talk about Sypical, we talk about Arsenal, we don't really talk about AXB. He had a great World Championship, and we talked about that a lot in the pre-show. So I can completely agree there. Monaco at 39.8%. So I guess I can see it a bit. We'll see where they land when all is said and done. I don't necessarily agree. But again, I think it's just people are hopeful for these rival series guys coming in just to see how they do. Next up, Hoxter at 40.1%. That's somewhat underrated. I don't see this just because I feel like everyone knows he's the best player on E United. Maybe people just think he's that much better than the players on E United. But I don't really see it because like a lot of the rumors going around throughout the offseason was him going to Cloud9 and all that stuff. So I don't necessarily see him being underrated necessarily, but definitely a good player. And number one is ignite. Now this one I think could have a lot to do with that interview. I think it was a season ago where ignite's talking about when he got kicked from TSM, he didn't even get a tryout on any RLCS team. And that hurt him. That hurt him bad. And he was about to retire until Tigre approached him. So ignite coming in at number one. I could see it. I think it's a redemption arc for him coming into the season, and we'll see if it pays off. So at 40.5% underrated, which means that fairly rated was still higher and overrated was pretty damn low. Moving on. Now we got somewhat overrated players, and this is where people get mad. Now, again, like I think this is one thing to note. Like this is just for fun. This is just a fun piece, and it's also like say someone's overrated. It doesn't mean they're bad necessarily. They just think they're not as good as what they're saying right now, or what the general community says, or the caster says. So somewhat overrated. We have 6 players here. JNAPS, number 1 at 34. Oh, I'm sorry, number 6 at 34.4%. I think this has somewhat to do with the correlation with Rizzo. JNAPS, if we talked a year ago, I think this makes a lot more sense, where we were talking a lot on the knapsack stuff. Probably about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, where he kind of was toning down from being one of the best players in the world to just being a pretty good player. And I think that was more of a year to a year and a half ago, where people were kind of getting annoyed by the knapsack and stuff like that. I don't know how you can put him at somewhat overrated after that promotion performance. I think it's just a lingering effect of a year to a year and a half ago, when I think he was one of the most overrated players back then. Next up, we got Rapid at 35.9%. I think it was just because people don't like Rapid, personally. Knights, moving on. We're going to go to 35.9% as well. I think this could be maybe a mixture of, was it a flash in the pan? Can they do it again? Which they kind of showed in back-to-back events that they could do it again. But now with replacing Mist for AJ, I think some people could be saying they're kind of overrated. They're probably that hot pick to say, like one of the better teams that you expect to make a world championship again, to fall out and not make the world championship, maybe not even make playoffs, like completely drop out. I think Knights would be a pretty popular pick for that, which is why I kind of think like it's already caught up to the Knights, and maybe they're not overrated at this point, but I could see coming into the season. Ronicky at 36.7%, the golden striker from last season. I don't know. I don't see a lot of people praising Ronicky all that much. Maybe they're more on the case of Barca kicking Bluey rather than Ronicky or Devo. Personally, I would have had Devo in this spot over Ronicky. Devo didn't make any of these lists because I think Devo's pretty overrated in my opinion. Ronicky did what he needed to do. He was a good shooter, except when it came down to Champions Field. Then things kind of got bad for him. So maybe he shouldn't look at the background of this video. But just don't put Ronicky on Champions Field, and you're perfectly fine. Squishy at 40.9%. This one surprises me because I think, I would have said, I think this is more because Cloud9 kind of bombed out last season. But before last season, sure, overrated. I think Squishy was trying to hold together this team last season for the most part. But Cloud9 obviously bombed out. And I think you obviously have to blame all three players at some point. I'm just surprised that Squishy gets more blame than a Torment or something like that. So Squishy at 40.9%. It's probably also because he's very popular. So there is a huge fan base around Squishy saying he's the best in the world. And obviously that's not true. So I think that's where it comes from. And I guess I would agree because of the fan base. But for that reason, I would probably also put Rizzo maybe up here. But I guess there is more criticism towards Rizzo than there is Squishy in terms of their fan bases. So, all right. You know what? Fair point. I'll give this one to Reddit. Fair point. Alpha 54, it's somewhat overrated at 41.2%. So I don't know, because I think I would rate him overrated, personally, somewhat overrated. Just because I think everyone thinks he's a god, but at the same time, it's also look at his teammates the past 2 seasons. He really had to carry those teams. He played pretty well. It's my one worry is his defensive capability on his rotations and all that stuff. But he is a really, really good player. I guess I would also rate him somewhat overrated. Maybe not this high. But I'm surprised. I don't know. I'm surprised because I thought Reddit was more on the alpha train, personally. Maybe it's the whole kick and scrub thing, because people are going to say Scrub's a pretty damn good player. One of the best in the world, if not the best. Now we got some fighting words here, boys. We got overrated RLCS players, and oh boy, I got some words. All right, guys. So I just want to say this right now, Reddit. You wouldn't say this to Gimmick's face. You wouldn't say it was overrated. One of the best historically RLCS players in terms of offensive capability, Gimmick at 42.7%. Sure, he had a bad season last year, which I think he got plenty of flack for, which is why I don't think he's overrated. But this guy is one of the best offensive players to play Rocket League, and he's never gotten the credit. Never from the community. Ever. When Cloud9 was really good, everyone talks about Squishy. Or they talk about Torment, the backbone. I think this is completely opposite. Now, because of the bad season, I wouldn't put him underrated or anything like that. I think he would just be fairly rated. But oh my, I don't even know. Gimmick is probably the most underrated Cloud9 player there is in the history of Cloud9, at least, by far. And I think you guys are all crazy. You guys are all nuts. Maybe that's why he's overrated, because I just jump on that Gimmick fanboy-ness. Maybe that's what it is, but you guys are nuts. You guys are absolutely nuts. Barca at 43.6%. You know what? I will take full credit for this one. Barca, I said you were the best team in Europe last year, and you failed me, and I could see why people say you're overrated. Now with Flakes, people are not happy about Flakes going to Barca. They think he's very overrated. We'll get to him in a little bit. I could see it a bit. Fair point. First Killer at 43.6%. Historically, now these are tied, but whatever. And we had a few other ties. Who cares? First Killer. Now, historically, when a new player comes in that has no rival series experience, they do pretty well. So we'll see how First Killer does. But I thought this would be a little bit more on the side of so there's players that come from the Johnny Boy 1v1s, right? Where they get a lot of hype around those players. And I would think that it would be, for the most part, more fairly rated. But I guess a lot of people, when they see a Johnny Boy 1v1, they automatically assume that these players are the best players in the world, no matter what they play. And that's what it seems like we see a common trend here a little bit. We see Alpha on the list. We see First Killer. We'll see Flakes later. So we're starting to see a common trend of the people voting in this poll obviously are not the ones that are talking about the 1v1 capabilities of these players and saying that can translate to any of these other categories. But we see that here with First Killer. AJ at 49.3%. I think this has to do a lot with how the Pittsburgh Knights got rid of Mist and picked up AJ. And I think a lot of people think it's the wrong move. And I would agree. And I think, honestly, the consensus is, like, it could be the wrong move. But I think the overratedness is more about the Pittsburgh Knights picking him up. And like, everyone thinking that is overrated. So AJ's going to have to prove a lot of doubters wrong this season at 49.3%. Number 1, Flakes. His team, Barca, is on the list. Flakes at 50.5%. Obviously had a miserable RLCS season last season. And now he's got to try it on a different team. He gets picked up for Bluey. So Bluey was obviously not on these lists because he's not in the RLCS anymore. I wonder where he would have been put. But Flakes at 50.5%, over half of the votes think Flakes is overrated. So Flakes got to prove a lot of doubters wrong. And he's got a pretty big fan base too. But one of those other guys that came, or at least got popular because of the 1v1s, I would say, to some extent. But going to be interesting to see if these guys can prove doubters wrong. Now, if you want the full list, the full charts, and all of that, you can go to the Reddit link down below. Join the discussion. It's a fun list to talk about. But yeah, there's teams on there, and then there's each player. And also, John also adds like a little caption about each team, about some of the interesting parts. Like one of them was Turbo Pulsa is the most overrated on his team and the most underrated on his team. So things like that are just interesting to see. Yeah. So go check it out. Thank you, John, for the post. I thought it was really interesting. I love these conversation pieces on Rocket League Esports, and I figured I'd make a video of it. Sorry I'm taking your content, but I thought it was fun to do. And I love you, and I love everyone that's watching this. Goodbye. Watch RLCS this weekend. Watch it.